Great. Guys, as always, it's LinkedIn. It's live streaming from our Zoom, and sometimes we have issues. My name is Ruslan. I'm very welcome you, everybody, for today's meeting about just amazing story of, I would say, a success story. But Dennis, our um, today's invitee will share his personal story. This is the story of his team, how they migrated from the Happy Soup, and how they continue to do that on their Salesforce work. I'm really excited about this story, and I'm sure you will be too. I'm more than confident that it will be very beneficial for all levels of the Salesforce engineers, admins, and consultants. Yeah, no more words from my side. Dennis, please introduce yourself, and the mic is yours.
Thank you, Ruslan. So, hi, everybody. I'm very honored to be here. My name is Dennis, Dennis Grzyb. Grzyb is also fine. And I am here to talk about, my Happy Soup story about of how by investing a little bit of time, we now don't have to choose between quality and speed. Just to quickly introduce myself, I am a managing consultant and lead Salesforce architect at Mindsquare. I've been there since 2017, and my certifications with Salesforce are application architect and development lifecycle and deployment architect. However, I also have an ISAQB software architect certification. It did help a little bit in this case, so I thought I'd mention it. My focus lies in expertise lies in framework development and handling enterprise orgs. And my first stints in consulting for development processes started in 2018 with the measly tools we had back then, of course, which included the ANT migration tool, which I think some of you still have fond or not so fond memories of. But of course, as technology advanced, so did our development processes. To quickly introduce Mindsquare as a company, we are a Salesforce and SAP consultancy based in Germany. So also most of our customers are in the Germany, Austria, Switzerland region. Our headquarters is in Bielefeld. However, we also have offices in Berlin and Düsseldorf. And we've been on a good success, like on a good upward trend. Our customer projects are increasing rapidly. We've got quite a bit of turnover, and our customer portfolio includes a lot of the companies that are on the top German stock index. So we are basically able to consult for a lot of different industries, including sales and service, human resources, production and logistics. We have a lot of process excellence in any of these fields. However, of course, you're also here to hear about my story. So let me just quickly show you what my agenda would be. First of all, I'm going to talk about, what Happy Soup is and what kind of customer story we are currently tackling here. I'm going to talk about the process that we used to untangle this Happy Soup and what Flxbl brought us now that we are actually migrated. And after that, I'm going to look at some of the learnings, caveats, and of course, an outlook about what we're currently doing, because after the introduction is basically everything is possible. Starting out, the term Happy Soup might have come up in circuits of architects for sure. In other circuits, it might not be as prevalent. However, to just quickly summarize it for you, it's basically trying to talk about the state of an org, of a Salesforce instance that has not been divided into separate domains. Domains here being several different business departments or processes that this org needs to support. Basically, when you are looking at a Git repository or a VS Code project, everything is contained within the same folder. I think most of you who have set up a VS Code project at some point in time do know the force-app folder. Yeah, that's basically it. It makes it hard to distinguish between processes and business units, and also makes it increasingly harder for anyone to really take technical ownership of one specific process, because you have to plow through the entire system in order to know what is actually yours. So what happens is you don't really get to know all of the dependencies of the different types of metadata, which makes deployments hard to manage, because sometimes you deploy things that you don't really know affect something else, or you fail to include a certain piece of metadata for your deployment that might have been necessary for the entire deployment to function. All of these things are basically caused and like increase in frequency when you are handling Happy Soup. So talking about our customer, which is called Minova. They are an energy company headquartered in Frankfurt, and they are the leading energy supplier for the Rhine-Main region. So basically for the region that is in and around Frankfurt, with roughly 3,000 employees in all kinds of different departments, including sales, of course. And they produce, buy, sell energy in B2B and B2C segments. Most prevalently, they are currently focused on electricity and gas. So what's the project that we're currently tackling? We are moving from left to right, from an on-premise solution to a cloud solution. Currently, the SAP systems in use are the pricing and costing for utilities module for any kind of sales processes, and the industry solution for utilities for contract management and billing. The goal is to bring all of the customer-centric activities, so sales, service, marketing, to Salesforce, and integrate this with an external billing platform that's also cloud-based and customized for the highly regulated German energy market. We are, of course, as an energy company in this case, using the Salesforce Energy and Utilities Cloud. For those that don't know Energy and Utilities Cloud, you might have heard of the term Salesforce Omni Studio by now. Basically, Energy and Utilities Cloud is Salesforce Omni Studio with some pre-made components and processes that are custom-made for the energy industry. And of course, as Omni Studio itself is basically a platform on top of the Salesforce platform, it enables you to create custom UI and integrations based on their technologies. We are currently in a split org approach, which means that we currently use two orgs in parallel. One B2B focused and one B2C focused. The B2B focused org was built up in a prior project. It's currently in active use, especially for content management and marketing. And it has running integrations with Avalanche, Marketing Cloud, and SAP ISU. So of course, when we want to develop new things on it, we are going to have to use a brownfield approach. This brownfield approach and what we inherited from this prior project were sandboxes and custom pipelines that were supposed to take care of the deployments. And our team especially is 5 Salesforce developers big, who have different responsibilities, but also sometimes help one another. The B2C org, however, has been introduced in this current project, and its focus lies on energy and utilities and experience cloud. They, of course, have the opportunity to use a greenfield approach, and therefore were able to directly get going with Flxbl for their new process. And it supports multiple teams, more than 20 developers. So there's a lot of development and merging, building going on over there. However, because otherwise it really wouldn't be as interesting, we are going to focus on the B2B org, of course. This B2B org, as we have also running integrations with, as I said, Marketing Cloud, has a few dependencies. These dependencies also include managed packages, most importantly, Velocity, so Omni Studio, and Marketing Cloud. However, we also have a few dependencies on unlocked packages that we don't really maintain. For example, Nebula Logger. If anyone does not know Nebula Logger, I highly recommend checking out the Apex hours that are going that should be available about them, and check out the GitHub repository for Nebula Logger, best logging solution in Salesforce I can imagine. So when we started development on this old system, on this brownfield approach, there were a few factors that we were not quite happy about. The first one was, of course, we had to handle happy soup. The screenshot on the right is a real-world example of what the repository looked like in the past. Basically, we had an unstructured force-app folder where we were not really able to distinguish between any kind of process. When we looked at the classes folder, we saw everything, which meant that we don't know if a certain class or a certain flow or anything of the sort belonged to service, sales, marketing, or any other business process. That made it hard for us to understand interactions between metadata. The custom pipelines that the project introduced had no technical ownership on the customer side, which meant that it was hard for us to understand the entire process. What we did know, for example, was that it was supposed to do delta deployments, which means that it should identify what changed in the Git repository and then automatically extract the metadata that has been changed and deploy this to the next org. However, we also had one big hurdle, namely that we had no clear way of reverting any kind of deployments once they reached UAT. Which, of course, when testing fails and we have to make some kind of, let's say, rollbacks, increased in difficulty. Development in general was also not that easy. Our sandboxes were hard to come by because setting up energy and utilities cloud in a sandbox was pretty much a hassle. So what we falled back on was having multiple developers using the same sandbox. And of course, as it always happens, one started overwriting the other in different states of Git branch, especially for centralized classes like test data utilities. There was no clear testable state on any system because of the partial deployments that we have been doing for quite a while then. So, of course, all of this led to dissatisfaction in the team and also a loss in efficiency. And that's where we decided that we also want to look at Flxbl and what it can bring to the table. So let's talk about how we actually managed to untangle this happy soup. For all of those people that don't already know about Flxbl, basically, they try to bring Salesforce development closer to traditional software development. Less dependencies, modularized development, and composition of modules as needed. And for this, we get guidelines, tips, and most importantly, the necessary tools to actually achieve this. So there is a certain structure that Flxbl proposes, which says to use domain-specific unlocked packages. As I said before, a domain would be a specific kind of business process or a specific kind of business department. This actually goes as far as saying that I don't really want only one package for my entire domain. I want to define a domain in my Git repository and create packages for each sub-process that this domain has. Basically, each package contains a specific piece of functionality, and in tandem, they create the org that we work on. Flxbl also gives us the opportunity to create source packages, which basically means we internally version metadata that we can't otherwise package. For example, things that depend on everything being on the org already. They are deployed normally using metadata API, but we have package and version numbers that we can use. And for me, basically, the most important thing was that Flxbl already gives us the opportunity to create continuous integration pipelines using their SFP command line tool, which automates the creation of Scratch orgs. It automates validations, deployments, and also the release processes. When we put all of this together, what would be the benefits? Streamlined deployments, on-demand validations with only really the dependencies we need, and the possibility to create orgs with only specific packages. In the end, we would have better clarity of what is actually going on in our org, and we have the possibility to actually assign ownership to specific domains, because we can say, this is your folder, have fun. After we had a look at this, the entire team was like, yeah, we want this too. Why can't we have this? So we started setting out a goal, because of course we have to go, we have to like make sure that we are not just starting without knowing where we want to be. Our primary goal was to accelerate the delivery process, because we knew that when we start, we are not going to be 100% proper at the start. However, any way that makes us able to use Scratch orgs and the pipelines that SFP provides would already alleviate most of our pain points. So we saw the introduction as packages as a way for us to make sure that the UAT and prod deployment and delivery processes can get simpler and more faster, because there's no human interface that has to distinguish between the different components of metadata that need to be added to the deployment. Flxbl, or SFP in that case, would do that for you. So once we set up our preliminary goal, we saw our first-app folder, and we started to think about where we want to end up after this process. What happened was that we came up with the following structure. I'm going to explain it for a little bit, so please don't feel overwhelmed by it. We have an order of packages. This order is important because some of these deployments, especially the ones below the gray boxes, depend on the other packages being present on the org already. So what we want to do is define these in the necessary order in our SFDX project JSON, and that will then make sure, then SFP will make sure that they get deployed in the correct order. We have 3 different kinds of packages here. The first, marked in orange, are the source packages that I talked about earlier. Basically, we have versioned, internally packaged metadata that streamlines metadata deployment. Then we have aliasified packages. These aliasified packages make sure that we only deploy org-specific metadata to the specific org, making sure that we have only the necessary data on, for example, our integration sandboxes or on our production orgs. Most importantly, for example, like we can say it would be settings or external credentials, because of course production doesn't want to talk to our MuleSoft developer instance, but to the production instance. The gray ones, the unlocked packages, are the most easy one, because these are the simple bundled packages that we already know and love, basically saying that we are taking our metadata and we're putting it into one bundle that can be delivered just like that. When I want to untangle Happy Soup, I have to do several different things. I tried to generalize my approach a little bit, and I came up with this timeline. On the bottom, you can see that it took us from December 23 to roughly March 24 to get going completely with the entire process. However, we were already able to use the repository structure starting January 24, and then we migrated the rest of our metadata into the repository later. We have to, first of all, of course, do something about what kind of metadata goes where, which is the first 3 steps: identifying package object ownership, structuring our source packages, and analyzing and moving our metadata. After that, we need to test our deployments on Scratch orgs and run pipelines to verify that everything is the necessary integrity. After we are done with the initial setup, we can start setting up our Scratch org pooling and introducing the process to our developers in order to then, in the end, watching the magic happen. Step 1, identification of package and object ownership. That's basically because we wanted a quick way to start with our decomposition. And because of that, we thought about how do we best divide our business domains. And the first approach that we chose was to differentiate based on the S objects that they are using. Basically, we said that everything that's going on in the Sales Cloud and in the Energy and Utilities Cloud, leads, accounts, quotes, and also the E&U specific objects like service points or premises would go into the sales domain. Everything that is used for the service processes, especially cases or knowledge categories, would go into service. Anything that has to do with consent and campaigns would go into the marketing and consent package, because in our case, Marketing Cloud can't happen without the necessary double opt-in given or without the necessary opt-in being given. So that's a logical combination. However, in the end, we also decided to divide our own developments into a separate package. This separate package would be Sales B2B, because here we can actually say, this is our package. This is what we are developing. And it made it easier for us to define clear ownership. Next up, we started sorting our global metadata. Things that either need to be deployed before we do our package deployments or after. Some metadata, for example, needs to be present for the entire thing. For example, our pick list value sets, standard value sets, or also our global pick lists. Why? Because, of course, when we want to introduce record types in our unlocked packages, they depend on certain pick list values being available, for example, in the opportunity stage field. We can't package those. So what we did was we put those into the global pre-folder as a source package to make sure that when the package gets deployed, the pick list value sets are already there. However, on the other hand, there's also metadata that depends on mostly everything being there already, basically the reverse case. Most important example here would probably be something like Lightning record pages, so Flexi pages, because they depend on all of the custom fields being there, like with the layout, or if we are using dynamic forms, then only the fields being there. And also the LWCs, flows, anything that you might have developed prior to this being deployed. So they are also put into source packages, and they get defined dependencies on unlocked packages. When we want to make a change in this source UI package, we simply make sure then that the unlocked packages that we developed beforehand, or that we have in our repository, get deployed before we try to deploy the source UI package, making sure that everything is there. Same can be said about permission sets, because of course they will include a lot of Apex classes and custom fields too. Yeah, you can't really do this without making sure that they are already there. Otherwise, the deployment will simply fail. Afterwards, we had to actually go a little more in depth. So we had to start analyzing and moving our developments. This process requires some knowledge about the code, the flows, the workflows, everything that is actually being moved. And therefore, at least surface level analysis of code was necessary for almost every piece of code or flow. We had to check what's the primary object that's being used, what purpose does it serve, etc. And we were able to analyze this to an extent where we knew, okay, we can put this into this folder because it serves sales, because it served service, because it was something related to marketing or double opt-in. However, we also ran into a pitfall there. And that is because when you have this framework, this trigger framework, or one of the many, let's rather say it like this, trigger frameworks that want to use only one trigger per object and one trigger handler per object, then you run into a problem when certain objects have to serve more than one domain. For example, we have to set a sales field on the contact. But also we have to set something regarding consent on the contact. And suddenly we don't really know where to put this. So we had to make a decision, and we had to actually extend the framework that we currently have to support the use of custom metadata and dynamic apex. I'm not going to go into further detail about how this currently looks, but it's the most rudimentary solution that you can imagine. And there's examples of this working also available on YouTube about actually the very same framework that we used. It's pretty straightforward, actually. However, of course, this means that some refactoring was necessary, also of the existing trigger handlers. So that's what we did. And on the right, you can see that we have now we are now using custom metadata types, a custom metadata type with different records, I'd rather say, for accounts, premises, and contacts and leads, because those have, let's say, more than one trigger handler with more than one, let's say, domain being served. What I want you to take into account, though, is that when you do your first deployment of all of your packages and you start dividing your trigger handlers into this kind of structure, there will be some time period, some, let's say, time between package deployments where a piece of functionality will simply go missing. Let's imagine, for example, that I divided the contact handler to a sales handler and a consent handler. Now sales gets deployed first and doesn't contain the consent functionality anymore. Depending on how long this time frame is until the consent handler gets deployed now, some nightmare scenarios can occur where integrations or any other, let's say, automations change a contact and suddenly things that need to happen don't. So what I want to give you here is that you need to take into account that you first deploy one handler containing the entire functionality, then deploy the second handler only containing your piece of functionality, and then you go at it again and you remove the double functionality from your first handler. Like this, you can make sure that the functionality always exists. That's very important. Now, this process, of course, took some time. But afterwards, there was also a slightly more time-consuming process, namely the testing phase. The restructuring that we did happened in a separate branch. We didn't do it on main immediately because we knew we had to go through a validation process anyway. The validation process that SFP prescribes is it tries to identify what metadata changed. So it identifies the packages in which there is changed metadata. It deploys the changed packages and makes sure to take into account dependencies. And it then runs Apex tests if necessary, but if not, it simply verifies that the deployment is a success. This is where trial and error come into play. Because once you start this structure and you want to have a look at it, it's very likely that you are not right the first time. So you will have to react to some of your test results. What I want to say to you is that it's very much worth it to take a Scratch org and test your changes locally before running your validations in any kind of CI/CD environment. We didn't. This is also one of the reasons why the restructuring took as long as it did. Some of this time was spent debugging our validation pipelines. What I would have done differently here is test on Scratch orgs directly. Why? Because Scratch orgs do start empty. So you can do this sequential deployment that SFP, the command line tool, would do too, and you can incrementally start fulfilling all of your dependencies. And if you see any kind of, let's say, missing reference or anything of the sort, you get the errors directly and you can directly become active and start fixing those errors. You can also, of course, start running your tests directly on your Scratch org and react to anything that might go wrong there. This process took some time, but after we were done with this, we were able to actually set up our Scratch orgs. I've talked to a few people in the past that said that scratch.org setup isn't really worth it or doesn't really make sense for real like org development, and that it's something that should be reserved for, let's say, ISVs. I disagree, because Flxbl actually thought about this and they introduced scratch.org pooling, which basically enables us to create a number of scratch orgs with the required dependencies and all of the metadata that we need. When a developer now needs a scratch org, they only need to enter one console command, and then they have a startup time of maybe 5 minutes, probably even less, until they get the scratch org that's already prepared for them. You can define different pools that can have different amounts of metadata, or they can leave them in completely empty for validations to succeed. So what we, for example, did was we created one CI pool, which basically just contained our dependencies to managed packages and unlocked packages and our global pre-package, because sometimes when we just want to validate something that the sales B2B package has changed, for example, we can't make sure that there's also a change in the global pre-package. We also can't define dependencies to source packages, but source packages, on the other hand, can, of course, define dependencies on unlocked packages. So the logical conclusion would be to prepare our orgs like they would already have all of the metadata we need for our unlocked packages to start functioning. The dev pool just contains all the metadata, basically a replica of our code base. We can simply pull it, start coding, and have fun. That's how fast you can actually go with this. So, of course, this sounds lovely, right? So when I started to introduce this to the development team, they were happy because they were used to handling our semi-functional sandboxes, and because that's just what they were used to, right? Introducing scratch.orgs to them in the form of a short presentation was pretty simple. I showed them how to use the ESF and SFP commands that were necessary to actually achieve anything. And then I told them to just do your developments, pull them, and create a pull request. Therefore, there was really no problem with acceptance, because everybody was happy that things work better now. One might ask the question, though, what about administrators? Because administrators don't really often have a very technical background. Our team doesn't explicitly have admins, so for us, in isolation, it was pretty easy to onboard everybody. However, there's, of course, internal administrators that sometimes want to make adjustments. For those, we basically now onboard them by having a developer do pair programming with them until they are able to grasp the process by themselves. However, they also don't always need to take a scratch.org for their changes. Sometimes a regularly refreshed developer sandbox also works, because there you can simply go and make some changes that probably don't depend on anything else. And if they do, we urge the people to take them into account. By now, the changes that our admins did were very isolated and didn't contain any dependencies. So we've been A-okay in that regard. After everything is said and done, we started looking at what it actually brought us. And first of all, what we noticed was that our development speed was increasing way fast. Where we had to double check before that nobody was working on the same class and make sure that nobody is overwriting my test data creation and make sure that the sandbox even does what it is supposed to do, we now had the ability to simply go and create a scratch org and just have at it. And it was such a time save, like per feature, at least several hours per week per developer. But not only that, we also became way cleaner, because when we want to validate our changes now, I don't have to go through everything, make a validation manually, don't have to hope that everything works nicely with it, with everything, because I see what changed. The deployment of these changes is done automatically in our CI validation. And the only real thing is, does it get any errors? No? Good. do I like the way that you coded this, or do I have suggestions for you in the form of manual code review? No? Yeah, okay, then I don't see any problem. So after we are done with our pull request validations and with our code review, of course, the delivery process also became simpler. On the right, you can see what Flxbl calls a release definition. Basically lists the packages that you want to deploy and the associated versions. Let's say that I want to deploy everything. Then I would simply use something that contains all of our packages. I can, however, also go about it and say, I only want to deploy my Sales B2B package. Then I remove everything else, or I simply add this one line to this file and add the version number that I want to deploy. This made it way easier for me to manage the releases because I just knew I can look at the latest version of our packages or the previous version of our packages and say, I want to deploy this. Which also alleviated the stress of isolating the metadata that I previously had to add to our manifest XML file and then do a manual deployment using the SF command line. Usually doesn't happen anymore. And per release, it saved at least 2 to 3 hours, sometimes even more. So all in all, the throughput went through the roof. Our features get developed faster. Validation happens automatically. We know what happens and what change is going to affect what, and we can release several times a week. Basically, our throughput has increased roughly tenfold since we have introduced Flxbl. Some people might be asking, but Dennis, you're using standard unlocked packages. Those are pretty slow to get created. Why use them? How can you do several times a week releases? To that I say, org-dependent unlocked packages are cool. We started with unlocked packages, standard unlocked packages in the beginning, and we didn't regret it because they give us consistency. We know that the dependencies that we are validating during the package creation process are stable. So what we do usually is release like 1 or 2 times, sometimes 3, rarely 3 times a week. And the way that we handle it is we do nightly builds. Like we merge our pull requests around end of business, and by start of business the next day, all of the packages are available for me to get released. Like this, I don't have any, let's say, waiting time that I would have to spend otherwise. I simply look at my repository and I see, oh, the packages are done. And then I can do the deployment, the release as I planned. Hotfixes currently don't have a coordinated process in our case. They rarely happen, but when they happen, what we usually do is we do a manual deployment of this specific hotfix, and we put them into the repository in the form of a pull request after the fact. Like this, at least they don't get lost, but we can extinguish fires still. That's the most important thing in this case, of course. So after what I already told you during the explanation of the process, there were a few things that I learned and that I would say are, let's say, something to think about when doing this kind of migration. So first of all, some metadata just isn't meant to be. We've had a few types of metadata, the most prominent one being service chatbots that have kept causing problems on Scratch orgs. We have enabled every setting, we've made sure to cover every dependency, and it still didn't quite pan out. That's when we started realizing that not everything the org has to get tracked in the repository, especially not if it's not really changed regularly or if it doesn't get changed on a Scratch org anyhow because you need real life data. Any reason is fine. It's not the end of the world to not include every single piece of metadata. If you're feeling adventurous, you can start adding them later after the process is already running. However, it's not necessary if the benefits of it don't quite show up just by being able to track it. One other thing is, of course, the choice of package type. When decomposing a large-scale org, it might make sense, it can make sense to start with org-dependent unlocked packages. Difference between those and standard unlocked packages is that standard unlocked packages, before they even finish building, before they give me back an ID that I can use for the deployment, they validate that the dependencies they have and everything inside basically works. They validate code coverage, they validate that they are able to execute everything. If they don't, then they throw back an error. Org-dependent unlocked packages assume that we have everything already, and they only validate it themselves by being deployed. And if they don't get deployed properly, that's when you get the errors. For obvious reasons, because the validations, the build process, etc., they don't take way as long. It can make sense to use the org-dependent unlock packages if you want to hit the ground running and really move fast. If you want to use standard unlock packages for the added consistency, you should prepare for a lot of last-minute adjustments because some builds just fail until everything is going smoothly, which, of course, for us also was the case. As part of the energy and utilities cloud, we also have to deal with deployments of velocity. It's added as a bonus to SFP. They can integrate with the so-called velocity build tool, short VBT, that Salesforce provides for automating deployments of velocity components. However, they ran into a lot of different errors. Mostly because there's a known issue that is regarding namespace components. For example, the components they themselves serve as part of their industry's CPQ package. As a result, we found it actually brought more value to scope out velocity deployments as a whole and actually do those manually when they need to be done. We are still able to provision Scratch orgs with the ENDU cloud, however, so we do have the possibility to develop new things for ENDU cloud on our Scratch orgs and then migrate them to the repository using IDX Workbench. They are also still versioned inside of our package, inside of our source package. We simply don't do automated deployments of them. We take what is inside the repository and deployment as needed. In the end, of course, there will be cases where Flexi pages or anything of the sort will depend on Flex cards, the UI components of Velocity, to be present in on the org to be able to get deployed. And for that case, we have prepared dummy components. They are simply empty. They contain the necessary variables that you need to set on the Flexi page. They are deployed only on our CI orgs in order to make sure that validations can still happen without the Velocity tool having to run. Once we started talking to sales and identifying what kind of emails they need to send, what kind of communications they need to use, we started introducing Lightning email templates. That's when we realized that Lightning email templates cannot get packaged into unlocked packages. However, they still use the same metadata type as classic email templates. The only real way to distinguish between them is reading the XML file. So to not have to do that, we decided to create a shell script that actually just does this exact thing. It checks the XML files for the presence of the identifier that says this is actually a Lightning email template. And if we find one of those, we throw an error and let the pipeline fail. This can actually easily get integrated into existing processes because any kind of build tool like Azure DevOps pipelines, GitHub pipelines, also GitLab, they all offer the opportunity to simply execute a shell script. So in that case, we simply added it to our validations and it works out of the box. One other thing that I want to mention is that dependent pick lists sometimes, for us actually quite often, have cost problems. One prominent example is that to distinguish between different types of product and product names on our opportunity, we have to distinguish between the values of one specific pick list, which says the product type is either for gas or for electricity. So yeah, This didn't quite pan out because once we started deploying these things, we ran into this issue that our pick list values didn't quite get resolved by Salesforce in time for the dependencies to get deployed. What we decided to do, though, then is to remove the dependencies from the unlocked packages and put them into an org-specific package, because then we can make sure that they are where they need to be. The good thing about this is that you cannot remove dependencies by simply not mentioning them. So if we deploy this unlocked package to an org that already has picklist dependencies, they don't get lost. Lastly, what I want to talk about is actually more of a principle kind of thing. Flxbl really emphasizes the use of modules. However, everybody who has worked with a brownfield org, with a happy soup org, knows that this is pretty hard to accomplish, because when you don't know where you're going architecturally, from an architecture point of view, then it becomes hard to really divide dependencies. And the result of that is that you have a lot of development that depends on the same metadata, the same objects, the same fields, sometimes even automations having to run in the background for this specific thing to actually happen. In order to not overload yourself with effort in this case, it can make sense to create a core package that can be used as a main dependency for all of the other child packages. Going back to the example of our package structure, the sales package was one such package actually. Of course, you can further decompose this core once you have the time and the energy, because you of course want to accelerate the deployment of this core as much as possible in order for all of the other validations to run faster. So going into the outlook, what's next? Well, the sky is the limit. I've said it before in the beginning that anything is possible now. What we're currently focusing on is, now that we're actually using this technology and we are able to benefit from it, we've started to further decompose the packages that we are currently using. What we also are going to use now is the creation of automatic release definitions, which also cuts some more time from the release process, because I simply need to double check that nothing I don't want to release gets released, but I do get the latest versions of each package every time that a build is happening. One thing that I want to tackle in the very, very near future is to provision Scratch orgs that already contain the core package, because oftentimes we are only developing in our B2B domain. So we don't really need the validation to actually preemptively deploy the core package if it's already there. We can go and we can actually directly get the deployment of the B2B package going in order to further cut time from the validation process. What we also did, of course, speaking about further decomposition, is decompose the sales domain already. What we first did was to combine the source utilities and the sales, basically saying that we don't really need two dependencies on each child package. That's basically what happened in the long run, actually. So what we did is we put those two together, but we did basically create a core that contains the key fields and objects from the sales package and the utilities. And we took business functionality out of that into separate child packages that have no clear other dependencies or nothing that is required by other child packages. And these you can see on the screen right now. What I also what we are planning is to also decompose the B2B package in a similar manner. Because we are basically using a lot of the same fields in different kinds of packages, we are also probably going to need to depend on a B2B core. However, the different kinds of functionality that we're creating, the data import tool, our approval processes, order generation, master data sync, etc., those don't have clear dependencies between one another. So we are able to isolate them, and then we are able to be more granular when it comes to deploying new functionality. When we say that one piece of functionality has successfully been tested for a release to production, we can go and we can release this one piece of functionality without having any untested things waiting, or rather being deployed with this functionality. This is where we are aiming for, what we're aiming for right now. So after all of this, what I actually want you to take away from this webinar is that untangling Happy Soup is a daunting task. Everybody who knows their system or the systems that they have worked with will probably agree with that, but it very much pays off. As soon as you develop with a small to medium-sized team, definitely. If you plan your approach and make compromises at the start, you can get better incrementally, and you can start benefiting from continuous integration, on-demand org provision, anything that accelerates and cleans up your process fast. So in summary, Salesforce development can actually be fun, and Salesforce DevOps can be fun if you have the right tools and the right baseline. What I want to say with this is, if you want to increase quality and speed, it does pay off to bite the bullet once. And if you have any follow-up questions after this webinar concludes, then feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'll be happy to, I'll be happy to help. And yeah, with that, thank you for listening. And I'm happy to answer questions that might have come up.
Thank you, Dennis. It was super interesting and amazing. Absolutely. We've got one question actually regarding the packages structure. So there's a question: do you have any recommendations or trade-offs on using functional packages like CRC, UI, service in comparison to using domain-specific packages? Those that will include things like UI, service, and Flexi pages inside of them, you know? What do you think about that?
It depends on the structure that your org followed in the beginning, I would say. Because in our case, we had permission sets that were cross-functional already. We would have had to decompose those on a more granular level too, in order to accommodate including everything across domains and across functions inside of the domain packages. It can work, I would say. However, it becomes way more difficult, and it will increase the time invest that you're going to have to plan for. However, I would say it's also feasible to, once you do the package structure the way that we did, to then start slowly including pieces of this functionality into your domain packages once you can be sure that there's no outside dependencies that you haven't covered.
I see. Well, there's another question actually. So it's interesting what is a criteria you use to break the package down to smaller packages. What is simply a judgment call or something else? What do you use?
I think to some extent, yes. To some extent, it's basically a judgment call, especially when it came to the decomposition that already happened. Looking at our metadata, it was pretty clear that there were functionalities that can be split apart. For example, there were a lot of asset maintenance batch jobs because those had to get regular updates that otherwise wouldn't have happened. So saying, hey, I want to isolate my asset maintenance from the core package, pretty easy call. Going like this makes things, let's say, not straightforward, but you can go by intuition, and you can also improve yourselves, or you can like deprecate components and put them into another once you see that it really doesn't make sense after the fact. So yes, in that case, it was a judgment call. When talking about the B2B process, let me just quickly go back to that, just to further show what I mean. We have clear responsibilities for these kinds of functionality in our team, and they basically represent parts of our sales pipeline. we have the data import at the start of it. We configure our service points after the fact. We have our approval process before we are even able to do any of that. So in that case, we know that these things, they can work in isolation because they have to. And like this, we are able to say, hey, I can isolate this part of the process into another package because one of our developers is focusing on this. The others don't have a lot of, let's say, overlap. And going like this made it, let's say, intuitive at least. What I do want to say, however, is that this, of course, is still preliminary, right? So it might change. This has not been done yet, but this is like a preliminary suggestion. As I also described with the etc, probably not all of the functionalities that we are currently creating in this B2B package have been mentioned here. So this is going to grow probably.
Yeah, totally. There is one small question related to the metadata duplicating. So Ravi is asking about, are there any tools available to detect and ensure the same metadata is not part of the multiple packages? And any automation you could think about? Because I don't know.
Duplicate metadata is currently not managed by us with automated tools. I'm pretty sure there could be something regarding this. However, the only duplicated metadata that we currently do maintain is our pick lists and everything, and permission sets that include, oh no, not actually, oh actually yes, permission sets that include external credentials basically. So that is the amount of duplicated metadata that we have, that we are currently maintaining. That's, let's say, able to get watched over by a human being without being overwhelmed. However, I do agree, if the org grows further and more duplicated metadata is necessary, probably looking for an automated tool will be on my to-do list. Currently, I didn't see the need.
Yeah, I agree. It's till you continue to use source packages and you migrate to the unlock packages. In most of the cases, you won't see issues. My own experience, we had these situations where we could have duplicated metadata for any different reasons. Okay, but once you migrate to unlock packages, the organization will tell you that you're trying to do some bad things. So
yes, I've run into this problem in the past, let me tell you. But the good thing is that right now, what I can say, the most important duplicated metadata is actually part of aliasified packages, because we have different credentials for Mule depending on what kind of org we are talking to. And this is pretty cut and dry. Once it becomes more complex, I will have to go into a case-by-case basis.
Well, depends on the use case. Yeah, I agree. Okay. I believe that these are all questions. Thank you again. That was very, very beneficial and informative. I'm sure that this is going to be interesting for people in offline. We will make sure that this video is then stays on LinkedIn and of course on the Flxbl YouTube channel. So guys, you can continue to ask questions in the comments right below. And once Dennis have the opportunity or the team here, we will be able to answer them. Again, thank you so much for this session. Amazing.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.